Forsaking all, I trust him. That's an acrostic from my younger days that I still remember that describes faith. Chapter 11 of Hebrews is a great picture gallery of individuals who had faith, and the writer of Hebrews uses these to demonstrate to his readers the real difference that faith should make. He had introduced his subject in the final verse of the previous chapter. We are not those who draw back, but we have faith, he tells his readers. Faith would be what would get them and us through the difficulties of life and the suffering that as Christians they would experience. In selecting the heroes of faith that form his picture gallery, he is in effect saying to his readers that a return to Judaism would not be a return to the faithful, but away from them. These heroes of faith had rejected the world that was for a world yet to come. They had treated the unseen promises of God as real as what they could see with their own eyes. As we look forward to and long for the day when Christ will reign over the earth, it is just this same attitude that we need. Looking at the world today, it most certainly does not appear that Christ is about to reign. It is so full of immorality and unrighteousness and inequality. But to the faithful, he will reign, as certainly as if it were already a present reality. By having this attitude, we will be equipped for right living in the world that now exists. We readily accept that the people mentioned in this chapter were heroes. However, we should not forget that at the time, and in their own lifetimes, they were not considered heroes. They certainly were not born heroes, but by the decisions that they took, the sacrifices that they made, their names, their example has been preserved for thousands of years. I wonder, if God was to rewrite chapter 11 for the 21st century, who would he cite as examples of faith today? The cast list is open to all who will follow in the footsteps of those who have gone before. Theirs is a legacy that has lasted for thousands of years. Right at the start of the list is Abel, a man who died for his faith. Straight away the reminder is given that a faith in God does help us in life, but does not guarantee that all of life's problems will go away. It highlights the needs for blood sacrifice. Our faith is based upon his blood, his sacrifice. There can be no forgiveness without it. Enoch, verses 5 and 6, come next. His relationship with God was such that we read that he never died. God just took him to heaven. What an encouragement for us to walk closely with the Lord. Enoch is also a picture for the faithful Christian who will be taken to be with the Lord at his return. Noah, verse 7, is the next picture in the gallery. Imagine living in a world where it had never rained, far away from the sea, and there being told to build an ocean-going ark. For about 120 years he preached to the world around him of the judgment that was coming. Only his family believed him, and yet he still persevered. Sometimes we may be tempted to become discouraged as we serve the Lord and yet see so little result from our service. Faith enables us to continue, despite what is visible to the natural eye. Abraham and Sarah, verses 8 to 19, are the next characters of faith to be considered. Abraham was called to leave behind all that was familiar and go to a place that he didn't even know about. Can you imagine having that kind of conversation with his wife and his relations? He stayed where God had put him, giving up on the everyday home comforts. He believed God when he was told that he and Sarah would have a son, and despite Sarah's age, she also accepted that what God had said must happen. How often do we try to rationalise things, to explain why we can't possibly do what God says? Not only did they take God at his word, they also did not receive the full blessing of what was promised. Our faith should not be conditional. If we see the blessing, then we will believe. These heroes of faith accepted that God would keep his word in his time, even when they did not, perhaps even could not, see how it ever could be. The greatest test of Abraham's faith came when he was called to offer up his son, Isaac. We read about this in Genesis chapter 22. Some years after the promised son was born, God told Abraham to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice. Would that not render null the promise that God had previously made to Abraham? In total obedience, Abraham got up early in the morning and departed, ready to fully obey his God. If God had told him to do something, then he would do it, even if he did not understand the why of it all. Even life out of death was something that was not too hard for God. This is the kind of faith that we need to have, though perhaps, like me, you might cry as the Father did to Jesus, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." Isaac, verse 20, Jacob, verse 21, and Joseph, verse 22, all confirm the truth of verse 13. They died in expectation that God would keep his promise. Right into old age, they clung tenaciously to what God had said, and it even affected them after death. It is one thing to trust God as a youngster in the first flush of enthusiasm. It is quite another to still be trusting God completely when all of life's experiences have taught us that disappointments are more common than triumphs. Moses' parents, verse 23, and then Moses, verse 24 to 29, follow on. Despite the most powerful man in the world saying one thing, Moses' parents behaved differently, acknowledging that God was right. Our culture shouts very loudly that we should act in particular ways. It will take real and genuine faith to say that what God has said is right, and to follow on that pathway. Moses was prepared to give up every earthly advantage. Such was his desire to obey God. Verse 25 is a real challenge to each one of us. Am I keener to satisfy myself with the passing pleasure that sin can bring, compared to the suffering that obedience to Christ offers? On the surface, it seems madness to make the kind of choice that Moses made. And yet, it is his name that is remembered by history, rather than the names of countless others. When God gave him the Passover ordinance, it had never been celebrated before. Imagine telling all the people to do something like that, and expecting them to do so. Yet in doing so, they were covered when the angel of death came upon the land. Worshipping God must be done in the way that he has commanded. It is only simple obedience that he wants. Faith is the motive for enabling us to do this. The destruction of the walls of Jericho, and Rahab's part in this, verses 30 to 31, just about complete the gallery of the faithful. Can you imagine doing what the Israelites did before the walls of Jericho? Those inside must have laughed at them. Day in, day out, they continued. For Rahab, her faith cost her the comfy life that she had made for herself. It meant standing on the side of her people's enemies. Closeness to Christ is not going to make us popular, but it is the right thing to do. The author then realizes that his list is too long to go into detail. He sums up by declaring that no matter what happened to them, this world was not worthy of them. When we live in faithful obedience to Christ, we are unlikely to be recognized for it. we are far more likely to receive the hostility of this world. However, we have the same promise that they all had. God has provided something better for us. Together with all the faithful throughout all of time, we will be made complete when we see him face to face. There is a day to come when I will be the person that God always intended me to be, no longer spoilt by sin. Now that really is a hope to look forward to. Faith enables me to know this to be true even during the dark times in life. Faith will always keep me pressing on to the day when I hear from the Lord himself, "Well done, good and faithful servant."